It's really good to be here again and to see everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Day 4, Law Class 102. But really, I wanted to start this afternoon by deeply appreciating every one of you. I want you to know that I did not take lightly the fact that you've lent me your ears, you've engaged, you've been very involved. And when I stood there the first day, I did say that it is not lost on me the wealth of knowledge and experience that I have this privilege of speaking to. And I remember also saying that you all are the teachers and not me. So really, thank you for ever listening and contributing. It has made this journey so far worthwhile. Thanks again. This afternoon, we are going to a very pivotal topic. It continues from where we stopped yesterday. And I thought that the exercise that we had this morning was extremely pointed. I was very surprised. I thought it felt like it was coming at the back of this presentation, but it's coming before. And just to set the ground rules, I'll be speaking before you for perhaps the next 1 hour, 45 minutes. I'll try my level best to make it as engaging as possible so that we can all follow. And so we are discussing the topic, sovereign debt. I'll start with a very short quip that we typically say within the legal circles around sovereign debt restructuring. And that is that we hold this truth to be self-evident, that no sovereign goes to the market to borrow with the intention to pay back. If by payback you mean, or we mean, retire that liability using resources or using revenue resources. Sovereigns in the 21st century borrow with the expectation to reborrow to pay the existing debts. And this thing just described is what we call the assumption of refinancing. The problem arises when you try to refinance and you simply just don't have either market access or willing investors. And then we turn to debt restructuring. And you will recall on Monday I made a very important point that debt restructuring or sovereign debt restructuring is not symptomatic of a policy flaw, but is indeed and in fact itself a feature of the international financial architecture. It is designed not to punish creditors, but to return borrowers to the path of sustainability. And so on that note, welcome to Sovereign Debt Restructuring 101. I try to make my slides a bit fancy sometimes. Okay. So today we will discuss the context of sovereign debt restructuring. We will look at a bit of an introduction. We'll look at how to understand what's this whole term, sovereign debt restructuring, which I'm all too aware that you're all familiar with what it really means. The triggers and the signs. When do we begin to think about a debt restructuring? We would then segue to a very important aspect of this discussion, and that is liability management. And perhaps you'll begin to get some sense of how a lawyer might approach the conundrum in your exercise this morning. Then we'll look at the differences between restructuring and liability. We'll look at domestic versus external restructuring. As I'm sure you appreciate, the Both carry their own different features. And then we look at the step-by-step restructuring process. So when you decide to restructure as a country, as a sovereign, what are the steps to take? And then we go to the options of restructuring and then the methods. And we'll discuss key players in restructuring. And I believe I have a few closing reflections for your benefit. So, by way of context, the International Monetary Fund estimates that 20 low-income countries in Africa are in or at risk of debt distress. African countries owe $685 billion cumulatively to external creditors, excluding domestic creditors, as of 2023. African countries will pay about $89 billion, we said it yesterday, in external debt service as of this year. And external debt owed by African countries is equal to 24.5% of their combined GDP as of 2023. This context is important, but perhaps you want to consider the poll on the screen, which is which of your countries is likely to restructure soon. I don't want to put any country on the spot, but I'm sure that we at least theoretically can imagine what countries are likely to be close to restructuring. And so this is a figure or a table of what it looks like as taken from one is one of the biggest data mining or data manufacturing financial companies, and they estimate that private debt alone in Africa, with the exclusion of debt to China, it's actually $262.4 billion US. And you can see that we still have a lot of exposure to multilaterals, and then we have to bilaterals, excluding China, it's just about 61 billion. Actually, that's about 80-something billion, looking at the graph. And then to China, we have just over 50 billion. And private China, we have just around 10 billion. What this shows us is that our exposure is not only diverse or varied, it's also quite enormous. And so this chart shows how much is owed to each creditor type that we just saw, etc. As of 2023, you can see that what we are owing is cumulatively 685.47 billion. Great. I hope this shows clearly. Is there a way to probably slightly minimize the screen so everything is captured for this particular slide? I wonder. But the reason why I brought up all of these facts and figures is to, when you see them, or as you hear me talk about them, you could feel like we are in some serious trouble. And you're probably wondering, so why in the world do creditors continue to lend to sovereigns? If we have this huge Brobdingnagian debt exposure, what is the motivation? Well, it's because, primarily, the annual default rates on debt restructuring, on sovereign bonds or sovereign debts, is just about 1 to 1.8%. Regardless of all of the noise, the truth is creditors or lenders know exactly what you're doing. Because in reality, if you think about it, since 1983, only about 10 African countries have defaulted and have been in the process of restructuring. The point that IGR and Dr. Cranell made yesterday is actually quite poignant about the fact that we prioritize debt repayments or debt servicing in our budgets. We've done a good job. As a matter of fact, what we find is that African countries, alongside their global counterparts within the same credit rating categorizations, are likely to default at the same level. So an African country that is rated as likely to default, let's say Baa3 under Moody's credit rating structure, has very nearly the same chances of defaulting as a European country under the same credit classification. But you keep on hearing, oh, Africa is the debt epicenter. Africa is in debt distress. But Africans or African countries are very, very unlikely, or are just as likely, shall I say, as any other part of the world to default or want to restructure their debts. So that's why creditors continue to come to you. I think the clicker, did I have a questions? Oh, so why do creditors continue to lend to sovereigns? So what is sovereign debt restructuring? Well, you'll recall from yesterday's conversation that we tried to preemptively deal with how to manage debt. And so instead of having to restructure, you can preemptively curate your loan contracts or your bond indenture in a way that will be favorable to the country so as to avert unnecessary fiscal pressures. But then there are times when, regardless of all that you've done to protect yourself as a sovereign, you still unfortunately are at a point where you're unable to pay your debts or you're unable to meet your debt obligations. And so the definition is on the board or on the screen, and it's simply where a country renegotiates. Yesterday we dealt with negotiating, but now with restructuring, you are renegotiating what was once negotiated, the terms of its debt obligations. And when it happens when a country cannot meet its debt payments in full and on time, or anticipates difficulty. And also, it is not a one-size-fits-all, as you see on the screen. It could go from mild rescheduling or reduction to deep reduction, depending on the severity of the crisis. So that's just a small table to give you an idea of what it could look like. So what are the triggers and the signs? And you see, the very important thing I want to highlight on this particular slide is what you see in yellow. Once you notice any of these signs, act. Oftentimes, you find that countries don't suddenly fall, or sometimes they actually suddenly fall into debt distress. Nobody necessarily precipitated the advent of COVID-19. It happened to all of us at the same time, in real time, and we all had to react. And so that's an exceptional situation. But there are other times when debt distress is not exceptional. So for instance, currency devaluation or declining FX, that should be corrected, it should be reserves, could signal capital flight or loss of investor confidence. When you see that your currency is getting seriously devalued, or when you see that your foreign exchange reserves are falling or plummeting, it's a sign, or it could be a trigger sign to watch out for. There is no, this is a surefire trigger to restructuring, but a culmination or a combination of these factors should definitely have your ears up. And so when you have loss or deterioration of market access, it's simply the markets telling you, we don't trust you to pay your debts, do something about it. At that point, you really, very frankly, have very limited options other than to restructure. If you have a credit rating downgrade, this may not lead to a restructuring, but it could be one of the things to just keep in mind that, oh, this is, is one of those alarm bells that you want to just keep in your back pockets. And then when you default on that debt document, because many debt arrangements, like we discussed yesterday, have this cross-default clause. And cross-default means that when you default on one, other loan holders or other creditors to you have a right to act on the basis of the fact that if you default on one, you can default on theirs. And so when you default on one loan agreement, you can assume that your other creditors may want to chase you. And then if there's a banking system crisis, obviously, we saw that with the United States in 2007, 2008, 2009 financial crisis. That could be problematic. And it wasn't just the US, it was also Iceland after a while. And if there's a sharp increase in debts, for example, to finance deficits or emergency spending, these are some of the triggers and signs that you want to be aware of, the severity of which you will determine in your own context. Now we go to something very interesting. You see, this morning we discussed Paradise, and Paradise has been struggling with increasing liquidity pressures. And one of the tasks we all had to do was to figure out how can Paradise fix this situation. And in the group I was in, I thought they gave very brilliant solutions. And I told them that I was going to talk about legal aspects. So apart from all of the economic analysis that you can do, there are things that lawyers would call liability management exercises. And so these are strategic and proactive handling of a government's existing debt portfolio to minimize risks, reduce costs, and improve the structure of public debts without necessarily implying distress or default. And what this essentially says or refers to is that perhaps you're just having a liquidity crunch. And you'll see when we speak later, we'll talk about when you want to get on a restructuring, you have to have a first determination. Is it a liquidity issue or an insolvency issue? We saw in the tax this morning that what was the issue was a liquidity issue. And on that basis, if it's a liquidity issue, there are things you can do. There are economic things you can do, but guess what? There are legal things you can do as well. And so one of it is debt buybacks. And perhaps you're familiar with this term, but what this term effectively says is a country can offer to buy back its bonds specifically, at a lower price, given market reactions to the country's economic situation. I'll give you an example. Comoros gets into a bond arrangement, and the bond was for, say, 15 years. And during the pendency, on the 7th year of this bond, the bond was to sell for, let's say, for example, $100 per bond. Now, by the 7th year, unfortunately, that 7th year fell on 2021 or 2020. There was COVID. And investors could see the financial fundamentals that Comoros wasn't doing well at all. And so, as you know, bonds are tradable instruments in the secondary markets. And when the investors, because of the fear that given Comoros' financial fundamentals and the fact that Comoros may not be able to pay back its bonds or pay back the full time or full amount of his bonds, Comoros reaches out to his creditors to say, listen, first of all, our bonds have now depreciated in the markets. So in the secondary markets, Comoros bonds are now selling for $60 instead of $100, which is the original amount. And Comoros proactively reaches out to his creditors to say, I would buy back all the bonds that you have in your possession for the existing market rates, which is $60. And by doing so, Comoros can effectively get back about 40% off of his debt exposure on that bond. Is that even clear at all? Is that clear? Seems so. Okay. And this is not fictional. And I always try to give you real life examples. And I noted here that our very dear Mozambique was one of the countries under the Brady Bonds framework that undertook a debt buyback. And this was in 1991. The good thing about that deal was that Mozambique wasn't alone. Niger also had a similar arrangement where they bought back their debts at a cheaper discount. And sometimes it could go as low as you buy back a debt at 30%. depending on the market fundamentals. Obviously, you are checking the market and saying that your yields have now risen, effectively making the prices sort of falling. I hope I'm right, economist. I know it's just opposite. Ugh. Anyway, bonds, exchanges, and swaps. So another way you can deal with a liquidity crunch is to approach your creditors and ask them if they will be interested in exchanging an existing bond. Now, these are real things. Argentina and Greece have done this. And you may be wondering, why in the world? Okay, first, when you exchange your bond, obviously you're exchanging them for better terms. So if the bond was supposed to expire next year, you approach your creditors and say, listen, we are having a credit crunch, or we're having cash crunch. Can we buy, or can we exchange this bond for a later maturity? So instead of us paying you back next year when it is due, let us pay you back in 5 years. And you can also ask, if you like, you can ask for lower maturity or lower interest. Now you might be wondering, why in the world would a creditor want to give me this? Well, guess what? A creditor wants to be paid back in full. Generally, that's their primary purpose of lending money to you. But at the same time, they recognize that the risks with sovereigns, and remember we just identified that the risk of default is just under 2% in sovereign bonds. They recognize that the risk of default of the sovereign defaulting has now increased, and there's a chance that if they go through restructuring, they'll probably not get anything, or they'll get something very minimal. Now, if the sovereign is saying that they want to extend the maturity so they can pay us back in full, we'll take it. Don't forget that your creditors are mostly, especially if they are bond holders or loan holders, they are mostly commercially driven. They are driven by profits. So if they feel the need that perhaps you just need more time, some of them, emphasis on some, might be willing to extend you that grace. You can also wager the possibility of flagging interest or currency swaps. And so your original arrangements in a bond, for instance, may have been on a fixed interest rate basis, and you want to change it to floating. You can reach out to your creditors to say, listen, we are having this situation in the country. Are you okay for us to do this? And creditors have historically agreed to it. Again, it depends on the circumstances. This is not a hard or fast rule. It is a possible solution. And you can also have switch auctions or maturity reprofiling, which is very similar to bond exchanges, except it relates specifically to just reprofiling your debt, that's extending the maturity date, whilst bond exchanges could include both the extension of maturity dates and lowering of interest in that arrangement. I wouldn't dwell on this. The difference between restructuring and liability management is debt restructuring happens when the sovereign is already in distress or already in default, whilst liability management is pre-default. There could be some distress, but pre-default is mostly preventive, whilst restructuring is reactive. Restructuring is often forced. At the time you get to a restructuring table, it's usually the IMF telling you, based on our DSA, you're unable to meet your current obligations. The BOP is not balanced. But liability management can be done at the whim or at the... May I finish? Yeah, please, may I finish? And please feel free to record your questions. I recognize that sometimes it's difficult after my sessions to ask all the questions you have. I suspect that by tomorrow, during my last session, where we deal with case studies on debt restructuring, we could take some time to answer any questions from any of my sessions that we've dealt with. But for this session, I will try to take questions after. Thank you. Restructuring often involves long, complex talks vis-a-vis liability management. Remember, for liability management, you're mostly, collaboratively asking your creditor to see a way forward before it becomes an actual problem. External versus domestic restructuring. Now, as I'm sure we are all aware, with restructuring comes the nuance of the external creditors and the domestic creditors, and how do you deal with both of them? Obviously, they're usually not both treated the same way, and for good reason, but also because they both bear different levels of complexities and different players. So with external restructuring, you're mostly dealing with international bondholders or international commercial creditors or even multilaterals who obviously usually don't fall within the perimeter of restructuring. We'll come to that. So you see here I said it involves debt owed to foreign creditors, bondholders, etc. Traditionally, countries in distress focused on restructuring external debt, for example, through the London Club in the 80s or bond exchanges in the 90s under the Brady Bonds scheme, and of course under HIPIC and MDRI that followed. External restructurings usually address foreign law bonds or loans, which cannot be unilaterally changed by the sovereign. Negotiation is required. And so you see the advantage of domestic restructuring is that you can change your laws and effectively impact your debt obligations to your domestic creditors. But you can't do that for your external creditors. Again, Greece in 2014 made sure of that. But obviously, as we discussed yesterday, you would have seen that external restructuring, the lines have been blurred. And that these days, under a debt restructuring, the IMF will usually go with the residency of the debt holder to determine if it is external or domestic. And like Rabi also mentioned, sometimes IMF is aware that countries are not very aware about this nuance, and so they may go with, or they may find a way around the established system that the country is already using. Right, Rabi? So tools to restructure external debts include exchanging old bonds for new ones. You go to your creditors after restructuring is done, take new bonds that gives better terms for the sovereign, which is what Zambia did, or one of the things that Zambia did in their restructuring. That can be done. Another thing is to amend the loan document. If it's a loan agreement, you can amend. And you remember from yesterday, I mentioned that in order to build resilience into your debt, your loan agreements, you want to have clauses that allow the possibility of amendments. And obtaining debt relief or cancellation from bilateral partners, thanks to the Paris Club and now the G20, this is possible. The process is complex because of these three reasons: diverse creditor group, different legal jurisdiction, and coordination challenges. I've been talking at you for a bit. Does anyone have a question? I just want to entertain one question about this. I know Dr. Krenner had his hand up. Do you still want to ask your question?
When it comes to our restructuring experience...
This is Zambia, by the way.
For Zambia, one of the criteria that we're looking at, it was the external exposure, even of our domestic market. It was what component of our domestic market exposure had what we call non-resident holders. Yes. So it was ascertained that it was not a significant amount of our domestic debt that had the non-resident, because what was being looked at is the impact on our balance of payments or current account. So in the case of Zambia, we had an argument to exclude the restructuring of our domestic debt.
Is it all of the domestic debts or just those of the non-resident holders?
We did not restructure any of our domestic debt. Yeah. Yes, so the exclusion was for the entirety of it, and then even the argument of there's a component of non-resident, it was not considered a significant component of the non-resident. And then what we've done is we've had restrictions in issuances to non-resident holders during this period. So it's limited to 5% per annum of total issuances. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Marianne. But you can see that one of the points she's highlighting is one of the difficulties just generally of restructuring domestic debts. So unlike external debts, when you restructure domestic debts, you are really at risk Please give it to the madam from Guinea who is just in front. You are at the risk of destabilizing your local banks, your local financial system, and that could also include your pension funds. And these people will fight you if they even sense that you want to do that. And Ghana is a good example of that. Ghana had people protesting against the proposed restructuring at the time it was about to be done. Because, of course, they feared for their future, they feared for their income streams, for those who were pension holders, and just generally feared for their livelihood and how the whole restructuring would affect them.
Merci, Monsieur Victor. Je voudrais partager une expérience de la Guinée. Je ne sais pas si on peut appeler ça restructuration de la dette, mais ce que nous avons connu, c'est que quand on a décidé, par exemple, de mettre sous le conseil du Fonds monétaire, de faire un seul compte pour le Trésor, comme je le disais ce matin, il s'est avéré qu'au niveau de la Banque centrale, le gouvernement avait d'autres comptes. Okay? Dans cette restructuration, pour ramener les comptes à un seul compte, il y a des comptes débiteurs qui étaient là. D'accord? Donc, le gouvernement qui venait de prendre fonction ne reconnaissait pas ces dettes-là. Donc, il a fallu mettre en place un mécanisme, une convention entre la Banque centrale et l'État pour pouvoir prendre en charge cette dette-là en faisant une titrisation. Okay? Donc, je ne pense pas que ce soit dans le cas de la restructuration, mais en tout cas, cela a permis à l'État d'améliorer sa position au niveau de la Banque centrale et donc d'avoir une marge pour pouvoir assurer ses dépenses. Donc, pas directement une restructuration, mais nous, c'est ce cas-là que nous connaissons, surtout en Guinée. On l'a fait en 2 fois. La dernière a été réalisée en 2023. Le problème, le défi qui est à ce niveau, c'est que l'État, en général, nous dit, bon, il y a la titrisation, mais nous allons ramener ça, nous allons commencer à rembourser dans 10 ans, dans 15 ans, dans 20 ans. Donc, en fait, la dette, elle est là, elle est dans le bilan de la Banque centrale, mais elle n'est pas remboursable tout de suite. Et quand on doit calculer la position nette du Trésor, on doit déduire ce montant-là de façon à ce que l'État puisse améliorer sa position. Je ne sais pas si c'est un exemple qui vous parle, Victor, et si vous avez connaissance et si vous avez d'autres conseils là-dessus. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Madam from Guinea. It's a very interesting point that she makes because it takes me to a subsidiary point I was going to make just about the flexibility of governments around domestic debts. And that sometimes it may not be a full-on, or it may not be referred to as a full-on restructuring, but because of the enormous control that the government has over its polity, it can determine how it wants to treat domestic debt in a way that would give it enough fiscal breathing room, even if it's not very convenient for domestic creditors. And this is something that we call, or we term, financial repression. And what it does effectively is that the government can adopt policies that effectively says you must hold this bond until the next 15 years because we can't pay you now. Or we can't pay your arrears, and for the time being until we pay, those arrears will not accrue interests. The governments can do things like this under a domestic debt and not call it restructuring classically, but at the same time, it achieves the same purpose of restructuring. It gives the government room, fiscal room to do what it wants in the meantime. And that's the interesting thing about domestic debt that is not possible in external debts. External debts, your choices are extremely limited. You can't tell an external creditor that they should hold on without accruing interest because you need to sort out domestic issues or because you just don't have the solvency for that particular debt. I don't know if that gives some color to your contribution, but hopefully it confirms to you that what has been done in that case that you describe is known or foreseen, at least, within this circle. Sabon, madam? Oui, Sabon. Great. Okay. There's a contribution here in front. And this will be the last contribution for a bit, please. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Victor. I believe restructuring domestic debt may not be as easy or comparable to restructuring external debt because one secondary objective of public debt management is for the government to help develop a domestic debt market. And we know that the main actor in domestic debt market are banks. So they constitute the financial system. And when you restructure debt, you mean contribution from these banks. That means that you weaken the financial system. And maybe later on the government will have to intervene to help this bank recapitalize. So I think, I don't know if it can be done at the same part as external debt. Because,
yeah, it's a good point, sir, you make, because that's precisely the problem with domestic debt restructuring. The fact that it could cripple the economy, the local banking system, and then the governments that has crippled it would have to salvage it by recapitalization. And so, but this regardless, Ghana was very swift to announce in 2022 or 23 that it was going to restructure its domestic debts. And it did, to a large extent. Now, of course, there are still outstanding issues with that restructuring, and we will come to that tomorrow when we deal with case studies. But it just shows you, but because Ghana was able to get its domestic creditors on board, Ghana's debt restructuring, within 18 months, they come to an agreement under the common framework. In fact, Ghana is seen as an exceptional situation under the common framework as compared to Zambia, for instance, because you see, with Zambia's position on not restructuring domestic bonds, on the argument that it doesn't significantly impact the broader debt perimeter, China was extremely upset with that position. Is that right, Marianne? Well, on paper, it says that China was pushing back. And as a matter of fact, there were communiques from the IMF and perhaps the World Bank, and the G7 especially, saying that China is dragging foot. And that even upset China the more. Well, this is what I read in Reuters, because Reuters covered the news apparently. But do you want to put some clarity to that? Because it seemed like China was unhappy, and that sort of stalled the negotiations as well. Or not? Or tell us why it was up to 3 years. Maybe I'm getting it wrong. Can we get the microphone to Marianne, please? And Marianne is all the way. You know what? Just for the interest of time, I can come down and give Marianne the microphone so that we get the clearest picture. She's Zambian, and she's the...
Well, what I can say is it was a new situation for everyone. I think restructuring of domestic debt it's not something that had been faced before in sovereign debt restructuring. So it was definitely a conversation which had to come to the table. If you look at HIPIC, MDRI, and the previous restructurings, they were focused on the external. And then I'm not sure I would talk about any particular creditor country, but the general concern was that by leaving this particular group of creditors out, then there was not what they call fair or equal burden sharing. So if you look at it from the burden sharing aspect, the MDBs were excluded because they were providing net positive financing, which was grant or highly concessional during the restructuring period. and then the external creditors, bilateral, commercial, private, were supposed to give NPV equivalent. Yes, so the argument of it was a very small percentage and would not make them worse off is where we're sitting on. I wouldn't say a particular creditor, but perhaps there was some apprehension with creditors which had larger quantums, not just for Zambia, but for other countries as well.
Thankfully, I'm not a lawyer to Zambia, so thank you so much, Marianne, for the color. And the reality is, and as she said, that apprehension was not a small apprehension. Marianne tried to... but that apprehension was one of the reasons why the negotiations stalled for 3 years plus, unlike with Ghana. And tomorrow we'll come to case studies, and hopefully there'll be a Ghana representative, and we'll really see from real-life perspectives, because all I'm saying to you, because I didn't participate in that restructuring, is what was available on the internet. So if you check the internet now, if you check news outlets, these are some of the arguments put forward. But people who are in the country would have more personal, in the ministry, would have more personal tales to share. So it's important that they share those perspectives tomorrow when we talk about case studies. Without naming names, of course. So balancing the two, deciding whether to restructure external debt, domestic debts, or both is a major strategic question. I will end by saying, in fact, one of the points being made about restructuring is that it is an exercise in laser surgery, especially if it is domestic restructuring, because you have a lot of factors to consider. Okay, so I talked about Ghana, we already addressed that. Zambia excluded domestic currency debts to protect local banks, to mix the limited, kept local. Okay, we kind of talked about this already. So you see, I say here that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Strategy must be surgical, and you're balancing legal feasibility, creditor mix, economic and social stability. Debt advisors often describe DDR as an exercise in laser surgery. It is something because of the potential ramifications of its implication. If you had to pick just one, which group should bear more of the pain, external or domestic? From our conversation so far, I'm sure I know where we stand. So we'll just move on. Is Judy here? Please, I want to know how much time I have. Time is gone? Oh, okay, sir. I'm sorry, sir. Doctor. Good. Okay, so I will be faster now as we go through the step-by-step process. So what I've done here is to give you a picture of a decision tree on how you go about debt restructuring. And this is just a pictorial representation. I have an explanation in succeeding slides on how to deal. But the very first question you want to ask, do we have a debt challenge? And if we do have a debt challenge, is it a liquidity challenge or a solvency challenge? Remember, if it's a liquidity challenge, you can deal with us through liability management, as we've done for Paradise in our group activity. But if it's a solvency issue, then you go to step 3. And in step 3, you approach the fund, or country makes formal request of financial assistance to the IMF. IMF and the country discusses economic financial situation and financing needs. IMF conducts DSA, and it indicates just because the IMF is conducting your DSA does not mean you should go to bed. It's also okay for the country to conduct its own DSA and check tabs with what the IMF is saying. The IMF are all the way down there in Washington, D.C. They are not in Burundi to know whether the price of gold is really as hurting the economy as they are saying or as you're saying. It's just like I'm telling you what I can read on the paper about what happened in Zambia. And someone in Zambia is saying, it's not yes, but not so yes. It's why it's important that you also conduct your own debt sustainability analysis, or you work closely with IMF to ensure that the figures that they are projecting to you actually reflect your realities. And then with the DSA, the IMF will let you know if you need to have a debt restructuring as part of a financing program. And if you have to have a debt restructuring, then you will have to enter into a staff-level agreement with the IMF, detailing the conditions of the program, the financing program to your country. And then the policy program is presented to the IMF Executive Board for confirmation or approval. IMF is agreed between the country and the IMF, and now we have a debt restructuring process already kicking on. The next question you have to ask yourself is, which we already discussed, is whether debt restructuring is a precondition to IMF's financial assistance. And if it is yes, as is mostly the case, then you go to determine how much debt relief to regain debt sustainability under the DSA. And step 5, you develop a comprehensive restructuring strategy and creditor engagement strategy. Step 6, you commence restructuring activities. And one question you want to ask yourself is bilateral debt involved? Because if bilateral debt is involved, then you have to strongly consider whether you are eligible under the common framework, which is now the latest iteration from the international financial architecture on how debt can be restructured. If bilateral debt is not involved, you can just negotiate directly with your commercial creditors. And we discussed that in slide 22. This is probably slide 16, if I remember correctly. But if bilateral debt is involved, you have to check if you are common framework eligible. And what is a common framework eligible country? It's a country that is at IDA, International Development Agency, prescribed low-income country level. And those are the countries that were usually eligible under the Debt Service Suspension Initiative of 2020. And whatever your answer is, if it is yes, then you go to slide 21 where I talk about engaging bilateral creditors and the restructuring process thereon. And if it is no, as in no that you are not common framework eligible, then you consider ad hoc restructuring. We'll discuss this in turn. So I already talked about this. When you get to the restructuring table, at this point, you know that there's a problem with your economy. You're probably Paradise, the Federal Republic or the Republic of Paradise, as we discussed this morning. And then you've asked yourself, on the face of the paper, it's actually a liquidity issue. Okay, we'll just do a liability management exercise. But if it's a solvency issue, then we have to get to a debt restructuring conversation. And then solvency issue really means that the sovereign cannot service his debts without imposing undue hardship on the economy and receiving exceptional financing sources over the medium to long term. And I put to make it easier for you to understand some of the indicators. Liquidity, can you pay your bills today? I have money, but it's in my ATM and they need cash. You are not broke, you just don't have cash. Liquidity. Solvency, I don't have money. I don't have money in my ATM. There's nothing I can do. You are insolvent. I hope that's easy enough for us. And so, restructuring process, the IMF and the World Bank guidelines, I spoke about this on Monday when I was discussing legal frameworks, emphatically stress the need to engage your advisors early. And quite frankly, if you don't think so, permit me to kindly advise that as a matter of priority, once you've determined that you are going to get into a restructuring, the first persons you want to be reaching out to are your financial and legal advisors. And that's why we all took a problem, I'm sure, with that clause, that confidentiality clause yesterday that says you should not disclose the terms of this agreement to anyone, including your advisors. Terrible, terrible, terrible clause. You must engage your advisors so that you all begin to work comprehensively on the technical and the legal aspects of getting back to debt sustainability. Communications advisors. This looks like it's not really relevant, but it's extremely relevant. Ask Ghana. You need to get people that will communicate effectively the government's strategy in debt restructuring. Because if the people are on board and they understand what is really going on, it's easier for you to continue your debt restructuring process in peace. The moment you're not carrying your people along, you may, especially if you plan to restructure domestic debts, you may fall into problems with the press, may fall into problems with protests, etc. I will begin to move quickly. So when you've gotten your legal advisors, you begin to coordinate with the IMF and the World Bank in order to determine the debt restructuring that is needed to restore debt sustainability and close the balance of payment financing gap, usually called, in technical terms, the restructuring envelope. The restructuring process, debt restructuring plan and strategy. So you have to have a plan, as we saw in the decision tree. And this plan outlines how the country will approach its various creditors. Obviously, you usually have, as we saw with Paradise this morning, they had not just multilateral, but commercial bondholders and other sovereign lenders. The reason why you have to determine who your creditors are and whose debts you are restructuring, apart from the fact that if domestic debt is to be involved, you have to surgically look at that situation, but also because certain creditors cannot be brought within the restructuring perimeters. And those are the creditors, as some of us would know, or all of us would know, who enjoy preferred creditor status. And that's mostly your multilateral banks, but we know the ones I mean, I'm sure. So determine the cutoff dates, the dates on which any new financing will not fall into the restructuring envelope or brackets. And so when you are undergoing the restructuring, there's a possibility that you are still getting new loans. Now you have to determine what date does those new loans that you will likely get not fall within the restructuring perimeter. And typically, I'm sure that even the creditors advancing those loans to you would not want to hear that you plan to put them in your restructuring process. If not, they will not advance the loans to you. So that's a given. But what if you're not common framework eligible? Now, what we just discussed is if you're common framework eligible and you're going through the World Bank IMF program and then to get your other bilateral creditors on board. If you're not common framework eligible, and those are countries, usually middle-income countries, under the current existing architecture of who is common framework eligible, you can do what Sri Lanka did. Sri Lanka is a middle-income economy, and they decided not to use, and they could not use the common framework. But look at the feature of what they did and what common framework says. It's almost the same. The only thing missing is that they did not have the banner of the common framework. They did everything, and by everything I mean they had a voluntary official creditor committee. So with the common framework, you have to have a creditor committee that organizes other creditors to act together towards your restructuring. And Sri Lanka, despite not being eligible under the common framework, organized this. They also had swaps that they used. There were GDP-linked bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, debt swaps that they used. Whilst under the common framework, what you usually have, the tools you have to restructure are usually the common or the standard rescheduling, interest cuts, and haircuts. Obviously, nothing stops you from introducing more interesting tools like VRIs, value recovery instruments. And without the common framework, we find that things are faster or more flexible, at least for Sri Lanka. And with the common framework, it's almost like a revised Paris Club restructuring. It's like an updated version. So things are still extremely formal, standardized. You have to bring the Paris Club creditors together. Sometimes it just takes time, naturally. But for Sri Lanka, it was faster. To what extent was the non-formal or standardized process of the common framework relevant to this outcome? That's an open question, but for some reason, we discovered or we saw that Sri Lanka's was faster outside of the common framework. Yes, so this is. But if you're back to common framework and you're having to engage commercial creditors, what do? Well, first, you have to ensure that your official bilateral creditors have formed a committee and you have entered an agreement called an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, on how you intend to treat their debts. So the MOU would typically outline the agreed debt relief, including the extent and duration of debt service. Subsequently, each sovereign creditor, bilateral, would implement these terms through bilateral agreements with the country. So you've gotten an MOU. Now, that MOU is not a binding legal document in terms of, no, it's binding. It's not an enforceable legal document. The terms of the MOU would guide you into entering an enforceable bilateral treaty with your new sovereigns. And so that MOU details how you intend to treat all of them. And then you will then have to enter into individual agreements with them. And a critical aspect, which I just talked about, is the debtor's commitment to seek comparable treatment. And this is another design feature of the common framework. The insistence that you have to get comparable treatment. Comparable does not mean the same. It does not mean the same treatment, but identical fundamentals in treatments. The reason why that difference is important is just because you get 1% from Spain does not mean you must get 1% from Slovenia, Great Britain. Or is that incorrect? Must you get the same figure, but similar, comparable? So, thoughts to flag that. And then, with the official bilateral creditor process done, you've gotten your bilateral treaties based off of the MOU. You then start dealing with your commercial creditors, and to even be faster, you can be dealing with them concurrently, right? And private guys are usually the difficult ones, aren't they? I'm sure we know that commercial creditors are not usually that. Sometimes it's the bilaterals, but most times, because private creditors are very, profit-driven, they could be a bit more difficult to sometimes deal with. But keep in mind that you need to engage them in good faith negotiations. You don't want to sideline them. You don't want them to feel that they're not part of the engagement. And the reason why this is important is because under the common framework, you must get comparable treatment from all your creditors. So you will still have to come back to your commercial creditors to get a comparable treatment. And remember, comparable does not mean it must be the same figure, but it must be a figure within the same community of figures. And so you have to keep your private creditors engaged. We are rounding off. And so the final stage of restructuring is legally formalizing debt relief with creditors. You've gotten your bilateral treaty on how you would deal with each sovereign creditor, and you've gotten your exchange bonds or new loan, amended and restated loan agreements with your commercial creditors. Restructuring options could include extending payment deadlines. We discussed on Monday that just simply extending payment deadline, except it's for a liability management exercise, for a pure restructuring is not very helpful because it means that the debt is just going to wait for you in the future. But another way you can restructure, or another option you have, is you reduce interest rates, have a cut on interest rates. This is possible, it's part of the restructuring process. And of course, the big guy is principal haircuts. Cuts part of the principal. There are countries that are notorious for not wanting to agree to any haircuts. You know them, I know them, we won't call their names, but just know if you're dealing with them. Or a combination of any of the above, and oftentimes a combination is best. This is just how do you effectuate these options? So if it's a debt exchange, you have bondholders to exchange existing bonds for new bonds under better and new terms. I want to talk about exit consent because it's a very interesting one. And the whole point of an exit consent is you have holdouts in your bond structure. Holdouts are creditors that don't want to participate in restructuring. They are so angry. They have no interest in this apparent nonsense you are doing. So how do you get them to play ball? Well, one way is through exit consents, and Argentina was one of the first countries to really drive this home. And what does it effectually do? You agree based on the collective action clause that we all agreed we will be imputing in bond indentures going forward yesterday. Based on that, majority of the creditors would agree with the sovereign to reduce the attractiveness of the bond terms. So, for example, remove the sweeteners like negative pledge. Amend your bond indenture to remove that. Remove cross default. And this is what Uruguay did. They removed cross default. At the moment they did that, the holdout creditors felt compelled to join the restructuring because that is such a sweetener that if it is not there, it's as good as being in default at some point in the future. So it's what we call the stick. So within restructuring, you have the carrots and you have the stick. The carrots are things like value recovery instruments, trying to make the creditors happy. But the sticks include exit consents or the threats of continued defaults, which doesn't work anyway. Okay, I have to run. Oh, so this is the last. We're already there. So key actors and the roles of these key actors in a debt restructuring. We have the debtor government, obviously. We have the International Monetary Fund. We talked about how they play a role already. We have the World Bank and multilateral development banks who are able to lend to you oftentimes in arrears, even when you're undergoing a restructuring, and still in good terms, so long as most likely you must have settled any arrears to them. The notes are there, and you'll get the slides. I don't want to belabor any point. Of course, these guys are always there. We have the traditional pari club, the new players, non-pari club like, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, China, etc. Private creditors, the bondholders, the commercial banks, etc. The civil society, and I must flag again that your domestic population are a part of a restructuring. Don't forget, one of my closing notes on Tuesday was saying to you, when you incur a debt, you are incurring a liability upon the people of your country. They deserve to be carried along in a restructuring process. They will fight. They will protest. They will carry placards. Others include courts because ultimately if things go awry, you can be sued or you can sue in courts. And multilateral initiatives like the African Union or the UN, they can provide political backing for debt resolution. Concluding remarks, here we are. Sovereign debt restructuring, as I'm sure you can tell, is complex. For those of you who have gone through it or who have almost gone through it, it is complex. And I say that to you, not to scare you, but to let you know that it's something to consider with the weight it deserves. We have covered the essentials like what triggers a restructuring, the options available, the players involved, and how the process typically unfolds. Oh, I have a closing word for you. We encourage you as finance leaders and debt managers and advisors to apply these insights to your own context. Think about how you will prepare if your country needed a debt workout. How would you communicate to the public? How would you sequence the talks? What pitfalls would you watch out for? It's as much an art as it is a science. It requires technical know-how like we're doing right now, but also strategic negotiation and soft skills. On that note, I would conclude and ask if we have any questions for 5 minutes. Do you have 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Thank you. So interesting to have no questions. When there are no questions, there are two things involved. It's either nothing was understood or everything was understood. And there's no sure way to tell. There's a question. Okay, so we'll take one question from.
merci de la parole. Et aussi, je tiens à vous remercier pour votre présentation très importante. Donc, ma question porte sur vous avez bien précisé que la restructuration de la dette intérieure entraîne plus de processus par rapport à la restructuration de la dette intérieure. Mais si vous regardez actuellement le portefeuille de la dette de certains des États après l'initiative d'allègement de la dette, c'est beaucoup plus préoccupé par l'endettement intérieur. Mais dans votre présentation, vous avez bien même souligné que la restructuration de la dette intérieure pose plus de problèmes parce que ça va déstabiliser le système financier de certains des États une fois procédé à la restructuration. Quelles sont les solutions précises ou bien quels sont les mécanismes appropriés pour procéder à la restructuration de la dette intérieure, surtout beaucoup plus qu'actuellement? Si vous regardez le portefeuille de l'endettement intérieur, c'est beaucoup plus porté sur les obligations du Trésor qui, en certains moments, ça relève au niveau des banques commerciales locales. Merci.
So, very good question, and it's as complicated as it's necessary. Thank you for asking. There's no easy way to answer how to deal with domestic debts. And that's because sometimes you actually have to get to the point where you need to restructure. And in those times, the implications are just as dire as any other situation. I can tell you what other countries have done in some of those cases. And I've seen that sovereigns do this a lot of the times. We talked about financial repression measures where they just compel, so the bondholders just pass a decree that says the government cannot pay your bonds now. It will pay, maybe not a decree, a policy, an executive order that the government cannot pay your bonds now, but it will be paid at this time. Domestic debt restructure or domestic context allows for that kind of possibility. What we've seen also is that sometimes the governments just ignore and allow inflation to soar high and then shrink the value of their domestic debt exposure. That has happened in a few countries. But another thing you can do is to invest in deepening your local capital markets. Because the more there's an investment in local capital markets, where the exchanges or the exchange system or exchange organization like the stock exchange is really deep, so that the currency of the country as well as other internal resource mobilization factors can be ramped up. And that's something that, if you look at the continents, with the exception of South Africa, to a large degree, Egypt, Algeria, and to a lesser degree, Nigeria, most of our domestic capital markets are not standardized or well established. And if governments can focus on building that, so that the stock of your countries, of the sovereigns, can also trade comfortably and properly within the domestic system. The more money you keep within, the better or the higher your currencies can also thrive. The more money you take out, and then you have to bring in external currencies, the more difficult it is for your capital markets to grow. So that's one advice I would generally give to governments seeking to ramp up domestic resource mobilization. Capital markets are important. One last question, and we'll close. Oh, you already had...
So I stood in mine.
Okay. Gambia, we'll come to you last one.
Yes.
Please, Lassana, 1 minute.
Short one.
Yes.
So I just wanted to get a concept on restructuring a debt that has a source of, that was acquired through a resource-backed loan. Say, for example, using your natural resources or all black that you use as a guarantee to acquire a loan, and then doing exploration, you found out that all black don't have oil. That debt already exists, and you cannot pay that debt because the the collateral used is not commercial quantity for it, that will be fluent to be able to pay that debt back. So
But
what do you do?
Cannot use it. You cannot pay the loan because the commodity what?
So you're using a resource-backed loan, a debt acquired through a resource-backed loan. Now, in this case, I'm using oil black as a case study. And the oil black does not have commercial quantity, so that means it's not viable. Yeah.
So what do you do then?
Yeah, that's the question I'm asking. In restructuring such a debt, what do you do?
I would answer. I'll let Rabi or Turia also chip in because they've also been very involved on the financial aspects on debt restructuring. But if simply your debt you cannot continue to fund or service that debt because the commodity that sponsors the service is no longer in commercial quantities. You restructure the loan, and then you probably stop if there's any automatic triggers to ensure that the payment is made either on a monthly, quarterly, or yearly basis. You kill that trigger and effectively default and then add it to the debt perimeter. Because what you just described is what we've been talking about, that you are unable to continue to service your loan. So regardless of the fact that it's resource-backed, the problem arises when the resource is still flowing and you want to stop it. Even without it continue flowing, if you want to stop a resource-backed loan, you just have to default. And what I mean by you have to default is you have to inform the lender that you're unable to continue to extend the resources there to the retirement of that liability.
So then, doing the contract negotiation, is it safe to enshrine in a contract that it's a risky business and there could be loss for both parties or win-win for both parties if such a situation arises?
I can guarantee you if you put that in your contract, they will not sign. What you can do is to include a GDP-linked bond or a commodity-linked clause. A commodity-linked clause effectively says, for the duration of the thriving of this commodity, if it gets higher in a particular year, you will get a higher value. If it gets lower in a particular year, you get a lower value. When you include that kind of deal or clause in your loan agreement from the get, it pre-informs the lender that this may not work in your favor if the commodity goes down, right? The problem is that the lender may ask for a higher interest rate or premium. But I want Rabi to maybe, are you okay too? Or is that? Okay. Rabi thinks I covered it well. He's a financial expert, so you think so?
Thank you.
Gambia, 1 minute and then we'll close. I know that we are way out of time. I'm very sorry.
Thank you very much, Victor, for, again, another scintillating presentation. My question is this restructuring, of course, will come at the back of challenges and then how to move forward. But what would be the experience of the countries that have undergone restructuring? After restructuring, because already some of the creditors had to do certain things, maybe not their liking, but because of the situation. Would it not also make it terms difficult or harder for you, afterwards? So what are the experience on some of those sides so that, one may not be tempted to be jumping to restructuring, thinking you can get your things right when it could also cause some other problems for you? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very brilliant question, and thanks for asking. And just in one breath, first we'll address case studies and experiences tomorrow, but if to just retire this conversation, I'll let you know, Ghana is a good example. Ghana restructured in the last 1 to 2 years, and guess what? Just last month, Fitch upgraded Ghana to, was it B or BBB minus? BBB minus, I think. I'm not sure, but they upgraded them after a restructuring because there were other economic fundamentals that you're looking at. You see, restructuring looks bad on the surface because it's like, oh, you're in trouble, everybody can see. What counts, oftentimes, as far as the market is concerned, is what you begin to do post-restructuring. And Ghana began to show that there could be a reformed or they can reform their economic fundamentals. They can commit to all of the conditions, for example, that the IMF has given them, and that they were committed to the restructuring and ensuring that all the creditors had comparable or a fair burden sharing, or felt like they were all sharing the burden equally. And this is why I made the point earlier that comparable treatment makes your creditors happy with you, but also importantly, if you're carrying them along from the get-go, they recognize that debt restructuring is an inherent risk in sovereign loans or sovereign bonds. It's inherent, it's part of the structure of the system. So when it does happen, it doesn't take any creditor by surprise. What they try to do is to minimize their losses as much as possible. They don't punish you so long as they feel that you're doing the right things to improve your fundamentals. Thank you.